Hey everyone, and welcome to the post-flop part of the course. Excited to finally be here, and unfortunately I have to start out with some bad news, because I'm sure you guys thought we were done with pre-flop, but we're actually not. Everything when we're talking about exploitation is kind of interconnected. So I'm sure you guys have heard the words before, I'm gonna open wider because there is a recreational player in the blinds, or I'm gonna open tighter because this guy's a really good player, I'm scared of him, I don't want to flat his 3 bets with a normal range because I'm gonna get outplayed because he's so aggressive or something like that. And these are real things. They can be measured and modeled like a lot of the things that we're doing in this course. Again, as we're gonna go through post-flop, I told you guys that it's a bit complicated, right? Things are interconnected. So we started with pre-flop, but we haven't finished with pre-flop. And in a way, whenever we look at any post-flop exploit, you should always have the question in the back of your mind, especially for big post-flop exploits, right? Like if the post-flop exploit is, 4 to a straight, 4 to a flush river, I think this guy is not going to be value betting thin enough, so I'm going to make a bluff catch. That's not really going to change your pre-flop strategy. But there are sometimes post-flop exploits which are very, very large and have a large effect on EV and are going to make you want to adjust your pre-flop strategy. So, like I mentioned, weaker players as an example, but it's kind of a misleading example. I think a lot of guys who say they have this kind of generic thought process of, if there is a recreational player or a weaker player or a fish, whatever you want to call him in one of the blinds, I can play more hands because he's going to misplay. And if he's misplaying, all my hands are going to win because, whatever, did he miss a value bet? Did he value bet too thin? Overfold, underfold? He made an EV mistake. This is not an accurate representation of how it works. Because, for example, maybe there is a recreational in the blinds who his mistakes are overplaying his hands, being sticky, bluffing too much, these types of mistakes. And when you have a player like this, playing a very wide range is not going to serve you well. Imagine we look at button opening range of 42% hands. So ignore the hand selection, but something like this. And we're facing a player who's just consistently putting in too much money, fighting too hard for pots. Now, you could say, well, all my hands are going to win extra money against this guy. But very often it's actually going to be the opposite, where, all of your good hands are going to win a ton of extra money, and all of your mediocre to bad hands, something like 10-8 off, maybe 4s at a low SPR, or ace-4 off, these hands that are not really making hands that want to play for stacks very often want to pot control, see a showdown cheaps, maybe bluff with like a suited connector like 5-6 suited. So these hands might actually start losing money, even though this guy's making plenty of EV mistakes. Very often a mistake is good against one part of your range and bad against another part of your range. And pre-flop hands have tendencies to get into kind of parts of your range post-flop, right? Like aces is going to tend to be in your value range. 5-6 suited is going to tend to be very, very often in your bluffing range, or you're trying to get to showdown range. And once in a blue moon, it's going to make something really good, and that's amazing, right? Like set mining. But a lot of the EV of the hand comes from being able to bluff or being able to show down a weak pair. It's not all from making the nuts. So yeah, everything is connected. It is connected in a more nuanced way than a lot of people think, and very often the kind of adjustments that you want to be making pre-flop are not as simple as this guy is bad, I want to play more hands. Maybe it's going to be this guy is bad, I want to play less hands but open bigger. Just as an example. So as we're going through the post-flop part of the course, we are going to kind of zig and zag back to pre-flop and back to post-flop, back to pre-flop, back to post-flop. Again, just as another, even simpler example, right? Like we said that in the pre-flop chapter, if one of the blinds is not 3-betting us enough, or he's not defending the blind enough, suddenly we get to start stealing button with lots of hands because our EV gets to be a lot higher. And when we looked at the Excel sheet, we saw how our ability to steal depended very much on call, 3-bet, and fold percentages. But we never mentioned that something like equity realization factor can actually be changed depending on the player that you're up against. And now imagine that you're against someone who plays fine pre-flop, but he overfolds to c-bets by 10%. Obviously, the equity realization for your weaker hands is going to increase by a decent amount. It's tough to say off the top of your head how much is it going to increase. Is it 5%? Is it 20%? Is it 60%? But suddenly these hands where a bluff should maybe make you $0, maybe the bluff is making you half of a big blind, and half of a big blind is a lot in poker with air. So just as an example here, if you look at how much equity we need in this specific situation, it's 32%. But change our equity realization to be rather than 83, we'll make it 93. Suddenly all our hands are making, with 32% equity, are making 7 BB per 100, and we're actually good with 28%. So pre-flop and post-flop are connected. If you don't realize this, you're missing out on steal situations, the same type of steal situations that we have here that are so profitable. It's all connected, right? Poker, everything is connected. You have to look at everything kind of holistically. That brings me back to this chapter, and the way I've structured this chapter, which I'm going to explain in a second, is we're going to kind of zig and zag. I'll keep it as structured as I can, but even as I'm keeping it structured and talking about, for example, bet sizing or c-betting strategies or things like this, you have to keep in mind the broader context of everything, right? Like, because someone is overfolding the flop, probably a bunch of other things he's doing, and all of these together are what's going to make up your strategy in the end, for maximum EV, of course, and fun and profit. Okay, so we're not done with pre-flop. Everything's connected. Next, I want to talk about 2 big blinds or a randomizer, river overfold math, and to do this, I want to bring up a very generic PO solver sim. This is under the gun versus big blind. And don't mind the parameters too much. There's nothing special going on. Okay? So, again, for people who don't use a solver, this should be perfectly fine to follow. It's more a math example of how I would want you guys as exploitative players to approach your decisions. Okay? So, 10-5-3, 2-tone under the gun versus big blind, we have a half pot c-bet. And the solver likes to c-bet 62% of the time. Okay, and as it's betting, if you look at the strategy, there are actually very few hands that simply prefer betting. Okay, so if I were to do spot and compare actions, you would see 0 difference between betting and checking on a surface level. There is like 5s with a diamond and a club prefers betting. 3s with certain suits prefer, but almost every hand has no EV preference. Whether it's aces or nut flush draw or some combo draw, every hand has no EV preference, which is interesting in and of itself, and it's something to consider and think about. How is this being managed, and is this actually realistic? But the way a lot of people approach this scenario is they start out with a c-betting strategy, and they try to make an approximation of what's going on here. So if they're c-betting half pot, they will kind of understand, there are inherent preferences for what hands do. When it's 10-5-3, I know, jacks and ace-10. They feel like hands that want to bet a lot. The same for sets. Probably same for combo draws. While something like 9s or 8s or maybe Jack 10 is going to bet less. And then there are a bunch of mixes. Bluffs I'm going to randomize. So again, for those of you who don't know, the idea with using a randomizer is you find something that is kind of like rolling a dice. So you can do this on Google. You say a number between 1 and 100, just click generate. Every time it gives you a number. And if you want to do something 60% of the time, a number between 1 and 60 will do it, 49, so we'll do it. So people use these random number generators to try to approximate the GTO solution. And very often a lot of the work that a player does is going to be on mimicking flop play, understanding turn and river play, and you try to become this GTO machine. You're going to go a step further, and again, 2 big blinds are a randomizer. So how do I reach the 2 big blinds number? When I look at solutions, very often, even more than I'm looking at my strategy, because I look at this strategy and I'm like, okay, there are frequencies here, but everything is mixed. And mixed means big picture, any hand can do whatever it wants. Unless someone is exploiting someone else, it doesn't really matter. So to me, this entire complex strategy is telling me, not Uri, you need to sit down, memorize this, do everything the chart says. It's more like, Uri, you can do whatever you want. Like, sit down, think, look at your opponent's responses, what mistakes do you expect them to make. And if you spot anything, you can do whatever you want. If you don't spot anything, you don't even need to memorize this. Like, it doesn't matter. Just play each hand in a logical way on future streets. You'll be fine whatever you do. Like, do it by your mood. You had a good day, c-bet. You had a bad day, maybe tank, check back. I don't know. Right? It doesn't matter unless some exploitative strategy is going on here. So, yeah, we bet half pot, and for the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to say I looked at my opponent's response, and I think this is a reasonable response to make. I think people study flop play enough. My opponent's fairly good, so he's going to get this okay. Turn an ace, check, and now I'm thinking, do I want to bluff with queen jack or not? And when we look at EVs, you guys can see this on the right. Don't worry, PL Solver. We'll move on to the chapters soon, and we'll have plenty of more deep analysis later on. But when we look at queen jack, again, whenever you see a mix in this kind of program, that means even if it's doing one option more than the other, it doesn't consider the option strategically superior, and you need to do both. Zero EV, and kind of like pre-flop, I kept saying the zero EV hands are hands you can play around with. The same is true for post-flop. So you have to bet ace-10 and you have to bet sets, but you don't have to bet queen-jack. You don't have to bet ace-queen. Like, you can go either way with these hands. You don't even have to bet aces. You can bet or check aces. So yeah, we're considering what to do. Solver says zero EV, and we're going to jump ahead to the river. Okay, so let's assume we bet. We got called. We get 8 of clubs. Villain checks, and we look through the bet sizes. For the purposes of this video, we're going to look at the 2/3 bet size. And you can see the villain's response to the bet, flop, half pot, pot turn, 2/3 river. It's going to be to call down like this. Okay? Let's assume we see this, and we say, okay, I think this is looser than people will play, because the line of going half pot, flop, pot turn, and then 2/3 on a brick river, it feels kind of milky. It feels like I have ace king, I'm trying to get hero called by worse. People emotionally don't like bluff catching against these kind of lines very much. Or at least, a lot of people. And this is a kind of read, we're talking about post-flop reads you can have about people. One of the big notes I take on people is likes bluff catching and doesn't like bluff catching. And if you want to think, well, how can you tell if someone likes or doesn't like bluff catching? The very general assessment is, if you see the guy make a loose bluff catch, he likes bluff catching. Maybe it's the situation and maybe it's you, and of course there is more to it, but very often it's just a guy who likes bluff catching. And always when I'm saying these things, you might be thinking, Or maybe he's just trying to play GTO and he has a randomizer he doesn't like or dislike bluff catching. And then I'd say, first of all, even GTO attempters have their biases, spots they like or don't like. Nobody's getting this accurate. But even, let's say he was playing GTO, then all of the tricks that I'm saying, I'm just fucking around with 0 EV hands, so I'm not doing anything. So I kind of ignore those guys. Like, if anyone's getting GTO close enough where all my guesses about him are random noise, it's not like I'm losing any EV, right? Like, whatever I do is 0 EV, so check, bet. Like, who cares? Okay? So, not thinking about those players, they are very, very rare in most environments. So, yeah, I think that here, if I bet 2/3 on the river, my opponent will probably call every top pair. He's never folding ace queen or ace jack, but he's not going to call with a 10 or a 5 ever. Just top pair. So I want to model this. And if you look at river, you can see in solver, betting 2/3 with queen jack is roughly 0 EV. And solver doesn't like to do it for frequency reasons, because checking is worth $3. Betting is worth less than $3, so you never bet this. That's it for the 2/3 size. If you look at jack 9, similar. Checking back is better than betting 2/3. Overbet shove would be better than checking, so we do that. Okay, so I want to model this, and there is a way to do this in PO Solver. One of the most important tools when you start out studying exploitative play is node locking. Now, personally, I always do node locking with the PO Solver 1 interface. They have released something new. I'm just not fluent with it, so I'll show you guys how I do it. And we'll keep in mind the frequencies. So we have fold 40.85, 25.6 combos, and raise 14.04, 8.8 combos, call 45.10, and 28.3 combos. So this is the initial strategy. We'll keep this on the side for later. And now we node lock, so we click tree, set strategy, and lock node, and we can force the computer to play differently. And I'm going to do this in a very simple way. So I fix the raising and the calling range. I have to click lock all hands, go into the calling range, change the weight to 0, and I'm going to remove not 10-8 because 10-8 is 2-pair, but remove the rest of the 10s from the calling range and remove some leftover random pairs from the calling range. And now we get the calling range I expect, and I will, of course, add ace queen and ace jack, the full weights. So I change the weight to 1 and add these. And yeah, we changed the calling range, and now I want to change the raising range as well, because I don't think people will check raise these random 10x on the river. Or, again, we're talking about, always in poker, we're talking about a specific opponent, right? Like, I'm not saying nobody will do anything. But sometimes you get a feel for how a guy is playing. So this is how I think the guy will react on the river. Don't mind the combinations, but call every ace, call or raise 2-pair plus, not really have check raise bluffs when I go bet, and not have, we call them bluff catches without top pair. Okay, so we do this, and you can see, so there is 1.5 less raising combos. There are 5 less calling combos, 5 more folding combos. And in the end, when we look at the call, 3.4 less combos here, 1.5 less combos here. So yeah, what's the big difference, you might ask? Well, if we look at the EV before of Queen Jack, didn't like to bluff. When we look at the EV now, of something like Queen Jack of spades that didn't like to bluff, and we want to subtract the EV of bet from the EV of check, right? Because we can always check and win $3. Now winning maybe $54, or roughly $40 with Queen Jack of diamonds, Queen Jack of clubs. So before, with no node lock, we would win $3 with air. With a node lock, we're winning at least $43, right? So 4 extra big blinds. Now, if we go back to the turn, and this is why I keep saying everything is connected. right? So this is a cool spot on the river. If you study a lot of different spots, you might find patterns about where people who don't like to bluff catch, what kind of runouts they're going to overfold or not overfold. And even bet sizing patterns to use where, were I to shove the river, my opponent would need to make some bluff catches, but he would get to fold most of his non-paired hands, including hands like top pair, top kicker, which he might think is very high up in his range. Now, the solver is folding ace-king, because when you shove, you don't have ace-king, you have ace-8 or better. So ace-king is just a bluff catcher, and then to look at how to bluff catch, maybe ace-6 has better removal effects than ace-king, like this is a real question. But lots of humans don't think like that. They're, when you slow played ace-king pre-flop and got the ace turn, you're emotionally very attached. It's just going to be hard to fold. The timer is ticking down, or the person's staring at you, and then people very often will click call with these hand types. So this might be a sizing that works less well as a bluff. For example, not saying, I'm always giving you guys hypotheticals, okay? So you make your own judgments about the lines. But yeah, okay, so we said Queen Jack on the river missing is worth 4 big blinds. So what? Well, if Queen Jack on the river is worth 4 big blinds, now let's go back to the turn. Here, Pio Solver on bottom right says betting and checking are both worth $27. But I know that if I bet, what is this $27 composed of? Half of the time I bet you fold, that's going to stay the same. The other half of the time you call, I'm going to miss the river, 90% of the time or 88% of the time. And that amount of the time, I'm going to win not $0, I'm going to win $45 or so. Okay, so pretty much we can say that, if you guys do the math, were you to integrate what we've seen on the river into the EV of Queen Jack on the turn, betting 111 is now an EV of $47. And checking is an EV of $27, even though our opponent is playing the turn properly, okay? Assuming, and you have to make some assumptions. I'm assuming this overfold is going to happen on most Rick rivers, right? Like there is no difference. 8, 9, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Everything here is a bit simplified. So, you could do the math more accurately, but maybe you win 3 big blinds. Right? I was rounding down the amount anyway. So, yeah, we're going back. Now you're on the turn with Queen Jack. Do you want to randomize? Queen Jack is betting 70% of the time. Is this where you want to put your study time and your effort? How do I play appropriately? Or do you want to be like, okay, this opponent, I would expect to be pretty suspicious against me and call too much, so I think bluff is just losing. Because he's gonna, when I bet turn, he's not gonna fold all these top flop, top pairs. He's just gonna call all the tens. Or alternately, you say, well, this particular player or players in this player pool or, with my image, even though probably he plays turn okay because he studied or whatever, I'm fairly sure I'm going to be printing by bluffing the river. So firing the turn with bluffs is just kind of mandatory. So do you want 2 big blinds or do you want a randomizer? Once you start thinking about poker like this, I just showed you guys a tiny kind of thought you might have on the turn, but you can have nefarious thoughts on the flop as well against some people. And very often, randomizing your flop play is like a huge dollar mistake in specific situations. It's definitely not, there definitely should be more to your thought process than, this hand type should bet 70% here, randomize. You want to be very, very aware of who you're playing against, and if you can find leaks in his strategy, very often this is going to lead you to a spot where randomizing it is downright silly in terms of how much money you win. Not in terms of if your goal is not to win money, but to get good scores on a solver quiz, then randomizing is better. I'll qualify this one more time with how complicated this kind of stuff is, because, maybe the guy would overfold if I went bet check bet, or, right, we didn't even compare that. people who overfold, who don't like bluff catching in one line generally don't like bluff catching in any line. And then you could say, well, check back EV is also higher. I wouldn't argue with you, but now we're starting to get into the let's open pre-flop really, really wide scenario. If you think the guy's just overfolding across the board in a specific situation, then you think this is a weak enough player where you can start playing without having cards. Okay, so all this being said, I want to give you guys a bit of structure for the chapter. Okay, so I'm going to start out by talking quite a lot about bet sizing. Bet sizing is a huge area in poker. And like before, we're going to look into history, we're going to look into sims, we're going to look into bet sizing, philosophies and archetypes, mistakes people might make, how to spot them, how to take advantage of them. I'm going to show you guys a few examples in my history where, sometimes the players I was making the most money from were not weak players. They were professional players who had sizing tells. And if you have a sizing tell on someone, guys, there are fewer things in poker more satisfying than having a sizing tell on someone. We're going to move from sizing once we're done with that to talking about flop play. And flop play is a big subject, from c-betting strategies, where, you can c-bet, you can range bet small, very modern strategy. You can go with a polarized strategy, whether it's a modern polarized strategy or an old school polarized strategy. You can sometimes have very big bet sizes. Flop play is kind of its own world, and of course the player defending, is he calling too much, folding too much, raising too little, tons of mistakes people might make, and each one of these leads to a complete strategy shift, or choice of a few strategy shifts for you if you know what mistake your opponent is making. Similarly to flop play, once we're done with this, which again is not a small subject by any means, we're going to talk about player archetypes, where, maybe it's not that the guy has a certain c-bet strategy, but like I said, this guy is just over aggro, or this guy is too passive, this guy is kind of too weak post-flop. Just giving you guys examples. And if you're playing against someone who's too aggressive, and I asked you which adjustments do you want to make against this player type, a lot of guys would be like, I'm just going to call him down all the time. But hopefully you guys realize that is the level 1 adjustment, and there is a lot more that you should be doing, and you're leaving money on the table if that is the only adjustment that you're making. Okay, so once we're done talking about archetypes, we're going to qualify things with sims, we're going to zigzag to pre-flop and connect this to flop play, connect it to sizing. We're going to talk about a concept I like to call strategic vulnerability. Now, this is, in poker generally, when we're looking to exploit someone, the more knowledge I have, the more spots I can catch you making mistakes. If we go way, way back to the first chapter, maybe you guys remember I promised there was like a weird weak top pair shoving river in a spot, and I said I'd explain why. This is what I mean by, that is, the more you understand, like, I know you're not going to spot that shove, and I know how to adjust to exploit that. And there's so much depth to poker. The more you know, the more things you can spot, the more things you can exploit. Now, this isn't the subject of this course. This course isn't like deep understanding every solver concept possibly in poker. This is a course about exploitation. But I'm just going to give you guys a few examples of, once you spot something, how do you figure out what are good counters to it? How do you construct them in a robust way where you don't risk too much EV if you're wrong, you don't risk getting leveled? How do you spot them? Now, I was looking at this sim, 10-5-3 ace-8. You can see if I put the flush on the river, there's a tiny amount of ace of hearts king shoving the river. And if you shove, you get called. Your equity with this hand is 36%. Similarly, there's a little bit of ace-jack going 2/3 on the river. If you go 2/3 and you get called, your equity with ace-jack is 48%. and can change the cards around, like make river 7, check, and we would see a6 shoving the river. Weird hand to shove the river with a6, right? Like you would think, sure, king 6 has a straight blocker, but a6 shoves the river when it gets called, its equity is 35%. Maybe you guys are spotting a pattern here. These hands are here, they're low frequency, but the fact that they're here or not here is going to shift strategies, and there is a connected exploit which we're going to look at. And there are lots of spots like this in poker where, again, the more you understand, the more you can do. So I start out talking about sizing and flop play because these are so basic, they happen all the time. Tons of people have mistakes in these fields. So this is like the bread and butter of exploitation, but as you play better opponents, you're always going to want to look for vulnerabilities kind of deeper inside the game tree. So the more knowledge you have, the easier that is to do. And yeah, we're going to talk about information gathering. Again, we're talking about all these things, right? I'm saying if someone folds too much and this and that. If he 3-bets too little, you do this and that. Pre-flop. Post-flop, we're going to have tons of things as well. But at the end of the day, and again, all of these chapters are going to be interlaced together, even if they're separate. Yeah, at the end of the day, how do you know, right? Like that's the big question. If I told you someone's overfolding the river, sure, it's easy enough to say, okay, I'll just start going bet with all my air and let's go. But how do I know he's overfolding the river, right? It can't be from a HUD, right? From Hold'em Manager or Hand to Note or something like that because you don't have enough sample size. Not to mention if the guy's an exploitative player, like hopefully you guys are, HUD doesn't mean anything in 6max because he's playing differently against every single player. So you might see someone who folds rivers way too much against maybe 80% of guys and calling too much against 20% of guys. And which type of guy are you? Well, if you're looking at the river stat, there's a decent chance you're going to be the guy who's calling against. So dangerous game to play looking at all these numbers, and we really want to gather the information in a different way. And yeah, interlaced in all of this is of course going to be poker history like before. And the reason I talk about poker history all the time is that the people you guys are playing against are not every single one of them, and maybe not most of them, but some of them are just people from a different time in poker history in terms of their strategic development. And you need these tools, you need to recognize these players to have thought about what to do against them so that when you do recognize them, you can make the most money against them. And just as kind of a closing example of how important this is, let's assume we're at a 6-handed table and I want to write down your win rate against the other 5 players. 3, 4, 5. This is a player, this is your win rate. So your win rate is going to be, say, 1 BB per 100, 1 BB per 100, 1 BB per 100. You're a really great player. And then this guy's like a weaker player, so against him maybe you win 6 BB per 100. And you're winning 10 BB per 100 at the table. Amazing. But, let's say player 4 is one of those guys that he's fairly reasonable, but he has one of the leaks that we're going to talk about, post-flop, pre-flop, etc. Maybe this can become high really fast, but just make it a 4. You've increased your win rate at the table by 33%. Then make it a 2, you've increased by 10%, which is huge in poker at high levels. So really, all the stuff we're talking about, it doesn't need to apply against everyone, doesn't need to apply most of the time. You pick up those 2 extra big blinds with Queen Jack once every 200 hands. That's 1 BB per 100 to your win rate. Insane win rate increase if you're doing this stuff accurately and as often as you can. So a lot of the reason I talk about history is to kind of connect things for you. These are real people. The leaks are often connected to each other, and I think it helps to understand who you're playing against. It helps to remove the fear. So rather than fear of getting exploited, you're like, this guy is c-betting 66% sizing on that board. That fits this player archetype. I'm going to expect these leaks. I'm going to make these adjustments, and we go from there. So, introductory chapter. Hope you guys are ready. Let's go with the next one.